The rain had turned from sleet to hard water by the time Margaret Muller reached Bow Street, and her pelisse clung to her shoulders like a second skin cut from ice. She ran beside the hired dray because Lady Muller had dismissed the last footman before Michaelmas and had not replaced him, and because the hat box tied with blue ribbon could not be trusted to a carter who smelled of gin. The driver flicked his whip and did not look down. The box struck her ribs with each uneven step. Mud flew from the cartwheel and streaked her hem to the knee. She felt the wet creep through wool, then petticoat, then skin. Her gloves were gone. She had sold them in January for lamp oil. The cord burned a red groove into her right palm, reopened yesterday's split near her thumb, and filled it with dirty water. She tightened her grip anyway. Covent Garden had been awake since first light. Porters shouted, barrows rattled. Women with baskets of cress and winter carrots turned to watch her run past as though she were an odd machine wound too tight and near to breaking. No one offered to carry the box. No one asked why a gentlewoman crossed market mud at dawn, with patched cuffs and leaking boots. She did not dare fall behind the dray. Lady Muller had spoken from the breakfast-room doorway with rose water at her throat and lavender silk rustling at her ankles, one hand resting on Lavinia's polished chair. "The Trenton silks must be in Hargreaves's workroom before noon," she had said. "If they are late, my younger daughter shall be shamed in front of people who matter, and you will answer for it." Then, with a glance that measured and dismissed in the same breath, "Do not look as though you have slept in a coal cellar. Keep your eyes down. You invite comment when you stare." Margaret had opened her mouth once, only once, to ask for the fare for an omnibus. Lady Muller's fingers had closed around her wrist with startling speed. "Run! You are not made for display. You are made for use." The bruise had risen while Margaret crossed the Strand. It sat now beneath wet wool, dark as plum skin under milk. Her pulse throbbed against it with each stride. Hunger made the city tilt at the edges. She had not broken her fast. She had not been offered tea. There had been hot rolls, butter and poached eggs in the room she passed, and Lavinia had laughed over a letter while crumbs clung to her lower lip. Margaret had stood just outside the threshold with the delivery docket and waited to be seen. She was not seen until Lady Muller needed hands. The omission had stopped surprising her years ago, but the body kept account even when the mind refused. Her stomach pulled inward. Her mouth tasted of iron. A faint grey flicker came and went at the corners of her vision, like cloud crossing glass. She slowed when it thickened and the hat box slipped, then forced herself forward again. The morning smelled of wet straw, horse sweat, crushed apples, and smoke from damp coal. The scent lodged at the back of her throat and turned bitter. She was 23 and moved as if she had spent twice that number in service. She had learned to conserve heat in small ways, keep the elbows close, breathe through the nose until the lungs burned. Do not waste words answering mockery. Save the spine for lifting. Save the hands for writing after dark. Her dark hair had been pinned in haste beneath a plain bonnet with the trim removed. A few damp strands clung to her cheek. She did not brush them away because one hand held the cord and the other steadied the box, and because stopping meant arriving late, and arriving late meant no supper. Her boots had cracked at the sole in November. She had lined them with folded newspaper until the print blurred and the paper dissolved. Cold water still found her feet within 5 streets. Her toes had gone from pain to numbness and back again before she reached the market arcade. Each return of feeling felt like needles pressed beneath the nails. At the corner near St. Paul's, 2 young clerks in decent coats stepped aside to let the dray pass and then looked directly at her. One lifted an eyebrow at the hat box, then at her skirt. "Lady in name only," he said to his companion, not quietly enough. The other gave a short laugh. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the horse's harness and counted breaths. She had discovered long ago that shame burned less fiercely when measured. 8 steps to the next paving seam, 10 to the gutter cut, 6 more to level ground. Her father had taught her numbers before he taught her dancing. He had said that columns did not flatter and did not lie. In rain and mud, numbers still obeyed. They kept the world from splitting entirely into humiliation and noise. By the 2nd week of February, the old grief had thinned into habit but not vanished. Her father's study still lived behind her eyes with cruel precision. Walnut desk, brass scale, German dictionaries, wax drippings near the blotter where he worked too late. He had taught her to close a ledger with clean fingers and to question any account that balanced too perfectly. "When men cheat, they aim for neatness," he had told her, smiling over his spectacles. "Truth is untidy first and orderly only after effort." He had died in late spring, before her 19th birthday, taken quickly by fever that ignored tonics and prayers with equal indifference. Within a year, her mother had remarried for protection. Within 2 years, her mother had been buried in wet ground, while Lavinia cried prettily into lace. Lady Müller had inherited authority with almost mathematical speed. Chairs were sold, paintings vanished. Margaret's small allowance shrank to coins, then to nothing. Tutors came for Lavinia. Dressmakers came for Lavinia. Suitors came for Lavinia. Margaret learned to mend cuffs by candle end and to write letters for tradesmen who paid in stale bread. When guests visited, Lady Müller called her useful, then corrected herself and said burden, as if the second word pleased her palate better. The dray lurched to avoid a stack of crates. Margaret slid in the mud, struck her knee against stone, and steadied the hat box before it tipped. Pain shot up her thigh. She rose without sound. The driver glanced back once, impatient, and clicked his tongue at the horse. She wanted to ask him to slow at the incline. She did not ask. Requests from her had become invitations for reprimand. Rain gathered at the brim of her bonnet and spilled down her collar. Her teeth began to knock against each other with a soft, shameful rhythm she could not fully master. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth to still them, and tasted cold. Near the market's covered lane she passed a baker's window bright with sugared buns, arranged in a pyramid, each one glazed and warm enough to fog the glass. A small boy in a clean cap stood inside with both hands on the sill, deciding between two. Margaret looked away at once. She had once decided between books in a stationer's with the same absorbed seriousness. That girl had belonged to another arrangement of the world, one in which fathers lived and mothers chose wisely, and daughters were not ranked like horses by beauty and dowry. Her chest tightened, not from weeping but from the effort not to. She almost never cried in public. Tears invited instruction. If any escaped, she wiped them immediately and gave no witness the satisfaction of seeing them fall. The streets narrowed as they approached the milliner's quarter. Here the stones were slicker, polished by wheels and rain, and the buildings leaned toward one another as if listening. Signboards creaked overhead. A coach swept by too quickly, soaking her skirts from the side this time. Laughter burst from within the carriage and faded. Margaret adjusted the box again and felt the muscles in her forearms tremble. She shifted it to her left hip, then back to centre when the ribbon bit deeper. Her breath came shallow now. Each inhalation scraped. The market clamour thinned and then surged again in pockets. A tide of voices around her. She kept to the dray's track. Keep pace, keep upright, deliver by noon, return before dark. The day reduced itself to instructions and endurance. When she reached the long stretch before Hargreaves's Lane, the church clock struck 8. The sound rolled through damp air and settled in her bones. 4 hours remained, enough time if the traffic held and the horse did not balk and no one stopped her to inspect the parcel, and no wheel caught in a rut, and no new command arrived to alter the path. Lady Muller's household had begun circling back toward her in recent weeks, though never with kindness. Captain Belham had vanished. Creditors had called twice. Lavinia had taken to headaches and silence. Doors closed when Margaret entered. Ledgers were brought from locked cupboards and set before her without acknowledgment, as though figures would arrange themselves by fear alone. She could read her father's German contracts faster than any clerk they could afford. She could detect false carryovers at a glance. She had become necessary and remained despised, a tool they reached for with gloved hands. The dray slowed at last, near the turning, horse-snorting steam into the rain. Margaret bent, hands on knees for one forbidden second, and the world narrowed to wet stone and the ache in her back. A woman passing with a basket paused, stared at the quality of the silk ribbon against Margaret's worn sleeve, and moved on without a word. Margaret straightened. She lifted the hat box again. Her fingers had gone white at the knuckles and red at the cuts. She set her jaw, lowered her eyes, and stepped after the cart into Hargreaves's Lane, carrying another girl's advantage through the mud as if it were her own duty and no one else's debt. She followed the dray into Hargreaves's Lane and was swallowed at once by a narrower world of dripping eaves, dye runoff, and the sour steam of boiled starch, where every doorway held a pair of eyes, and every eye measured cloth first, rank second, and weakness always. The driver hauled his horse to the curb outside a painted sign of a gilt thimble, jumped down, and left the box in her arms as if it had burned him. Margaret climbed the 2 stone steps to the workroom entrance, because customers of consequence used the front salon on Floral Street, where mirrors were tall and firelight generous, while deliveries entered by the side among bales, broken crates, and wet apprentices. Her sleeve clung to the bruise at her wrist. The scrape of wool over skin made her jaw tighten. She knocked once with the back of her knuckles. A girl no older than 16 opened the upper half of the door and looked first at the ribbon, then at Margaret's face, then at the mud drying in fan-shaped stains from knee to hem. "State your business," Margaret gave the docket without lifting her gaze. "From Lady Muller, Trenton silk, to be cut this morning for Mrs. Belham." The girl's expression altered at the married name, not with respect but with alert calculation. She unlatched the lower door and let Margaret inside, where 3 dressmakers sat bent over bodices in a row, and a forewoman with a tape at her neck held out both hands for the box. Margaret did not release it until the forewoman checked the seal. "You are late for so dear a shipment." It was 20 minutes past 8. She had crossed half the district on foot through sleet and market traffic. She said only, "The roads were crowded." A snort came from one of the tables. "Roads are crowded for everyone, miss." The forewoman cut the ribbon, lifted a fold of silk, and rubbed it between finger and thumb with the tenderness reserved for money. "Hargreaves will have his fee in advance for this household after last quarter's theatrics." Margaret felt the old heat rise, the one that began at the throat and moved nowhere because she did not permit it. If you require coin before work begins, you must send to Lady Muller directly. The forewoman's eyes flicked to her cuffs, to the missing glove, to the wet edge of her bonnet. "And what are you, then, in that house?" The question was not curiosity, it was taxonomy. Margaret stood straight despite the ache in her back and answered in the tone her father had praised when she was 14 and dictating invoices in 2 languages. "I am the one who returns with the receipt." The forewoman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, and she jerked her chin toward a narrow bench by the stove. "Wait there. You may carry back more than paper." She sat, where indicated, close enough to the heat to feel the pins of pain wake in her feet, far enough that no one would call her presumptuous. Starch thickened the air. Scissors clicked. Rain beat at the panes with a hard, patient rhythm. In the hiss of irons and the rasp of thread drawn through beeswax, she heard again the household arithmetic that had reduced her from daughter to function, and the sound did not belong to memory alone because it still directed where she sat, how she spoke, and whether she ate. The warmth near the stove brought feeling back to her fingers in waves, and with it came the ordered sequence she carried like a second ledger, each entry set against the next in dates, costs, losses, and names. Her father had kept his accounts in a hand so precise that clerks from larger firms came to copy his forms. He smelled of cedar shavings and sealing wax. He had believed in margins wide enough for correction and in teaching his elder child to read every line before signing the bottom. On winter evenings he would draw Margaret to the study table, slide a German contract across the blotter, and tap a clause with the dull end of his pen. "Translate the risk first," he would say. "Profit seduces, liability governs." She had learned to parse shipping terms before she learned waltz figures. She had learned that a missing witness mark could ruin 3 families. In late spring, fever took him in 6 days. He kept trying to rise on the 5th to check a packet bound for Bremen. He died with ink under his nail and apologies on his tongue for work left untidy. The house changed temperature that week and never warmed again. Her mother, already frightened by men who arrived with hats in their hands and questions about outstanding drafts, accepted the suit of Herr Müller, who promised order, status, and relief from the noise of trade. He was older, careful with his cuffs, fond of speeches about prudence, and father to a pretty daughter 1 year younger than Margaret, bright-haired and charming in the manner that invited protection without asking for it. The marriage contract folded households together by midsummer. New liveries appeared. Silver was inventoried. Portraits shifted walls. Her mother lasted 2 more years, thinned by grief and a cough that winter would not release, and died before dawn while Lavinia slept, and Herr Müller drafted letters announcing pious sorrow on expensive paper. At the funeral, Margaret stood with wet hair under a black veil, mended at the edge, listened to prayers over fresh earth, and understood in the same cold instant that mourning in that house would be rationed according to advantage. Lavinia was embraced and fed broth with cream. Margaret was told to review outstanding rents because tenants respected punctual notices, even in bereavement. She did the task that afternoon with her eyes burning and her handwriting steady. Herr Müller remarried within the year, and when a riding fall outside Highgate buried him as swiftly as it had promised security, his widow stepped into command with the calm of someone assuming a role long rehearsed. By Michaelmas she had become Lady Müller in the mouth of every tradesman and tenant, and Margaret had become the inconvenient residue of a dead father and a useful connection, worth keeping and easy to hide. What followed had never required raised voices to do its damage. Lady Müller preferred correction to rage. She reduced Margaret's allowance by half until household efficiencies improved, then struck it entirely when no one objected. She moved her from a bedchamber on the 2nd floor to the attic room at the back stair, where wind entered through a warped sash and frost feathered the basin each January morning. She diverted coal scuttles to Lavinia's room and told Margaret robust constitutions were cultivated, not inherited. She sold the walnut escritoire from her father's study to pay a jeweller's invoice and sent Margaret to fetch the cart that removed it. She took 2 of Margaret's gowns for trimming salvage, altered the sleeves, and had Lavinia wear them at assemblies where gentlemen praised her taste. At table she introduced Margaret to guests as "my late husband's serious child, very good with figures, no talent for conversation," then asked for a recitation of expenses as if requesting music. When creditors came, she sent for Margaret in the passage, pressed a ledger into her hands, and hissed, "No flourishes, no commentary, only what serves this family." If Margaret answered with facts that inconvenienced a plan, she was reminded that gratitude was a moral duty, and roofs were costly, the punishments were practical, meals skipped for digestive discipline, lamp oil withheld, so copying had to be done by kitchen embers after midnight. A seamstress bill quietly added to Margaret's column for alterations she had never worn. Once, when a visiting cousin remarked on the bruise near her wrist and asked whether she had fallen, Lady Muller laughed softly and said, "My elder daughter bruises if one looks sternly in her direction." Lavinia laughed too, uncertain at first, then brightly, because brightness was what she had been paid to offer all her life. Margaret had not been born meek. She had learned precision as a shield. She stored every slight where she stored exchange rates and lease terms, not to nurse resentment, but to keep a clear account of power. In that account, cruelty was never random. It flowed toward utility. When embroidery and charm advanced Lavinia's prospects, resources flowed there. When books needed balancing or letters needed translating from German merchants who still remembered her father, Margaret was summoned, seated, and expected to perform without acknowledgement. If she completed 12 pages by candle end, no one thanked her. If she corrected a false total in front of a solicitor, Lady Muller's fingers tightened once on the edge of the table, and Margaret lost breakfast the next day. The household called this discipline. Margaret called it management conducted without mercy. She endured it because endurance required less coin than escape. By the start of the new year, the cost of making Lavinia splendid had consumed what remained of prudence, and every choice made in silk now returned as a demand in ink, French lace on credit, muslin imported through intermediaries, music masters, dancing masters, carriage hire, dinners for men whose names opened doors, trinkets chosen to catch candlelight across crowded ballrooms. Lady Muller named each expenditure an investment and waved away caution with a phrase about strategic marriage. Captain Belham arrived with polished boots, military posture, and the easy confidence of a man who could borrow against tomorrow because someone else would settle yesterday. He courted Lavinia with opera tickets and promises of a townhouse. He praised Lady Muller's discernment. He called Margaret Miss Muller, our household scholar, when he needed a date checked or a clause explained, and forgot her name in the same hour. The marriage settlement was drafted in haste, revised twice and signed under pressure while rain rattled the windows and the attorney coughed into his handkerchief. Margaret read the numbers and felt dread like ice laid along her spine. Land rents had been overestimated. 2 sureties were contingent, not fixed. A portion of the settlement relied on securities she had not seen in any cabinet she was permitted to audit. She said quietly, "This exposure is too broad." Lady Muller answered in front of all of them, "Your jealousy has become tedious." Lavinia's eyes flashed with something near pity, then hardened because pity was not useful to a bride. The wedding took place with flowers paid for by a bill still unpaid in December. Within months the captain's letters grew irregular, then ceased. Men with professional politeness arrived at the door, asked for him, and left cards edged in debt. A runner from his club brought news that he had departed for the continent ahead of formal proceedings. The household went very still for 2 days. On the third, locked cupboards were opened. Bundles of old account books were carried to the breakfast room. Lady Müller sent for Margaret before dawn, not with rosewater and commands this time, but with a voice rubbed raw by sleeplessness. "You will examine these books. You will locate every transferable instrument. You will identify what can be defended." She did not say, "Please." She did not apologize for years of calculated diminishment. She stood in violet silk that no longer sat perfectly at the waist, and looked for the first time as though fear had found a seam in her armour. Lavinia sat by the fire in a wrapper, face pale, wedding ring turned inward against her palm. She would not meet Margaret's eyes. Margaret opened the first ledger and saw at once what everyone else had refused to see while music played: forged carryovers, altered dates, obligations bridged with paper promises, and German contracts copied badly by men who did not understand the language they counterfeited. She translated line by line while the tea went cold. She flagged inconsistencies and watched Lady Müller's mouth compress at each mark. She did the work because clerks, grooms, laundresses, and tenants would bear the collapse first if she did not. She did it also because Lavinia, foolish and favoured and complicit, had been shaped by the same house, even if never cut by it, in the same places. She did it, finally, because her father had taught her that truth untangled, late still mattered. The forewoman returned with a stamped receipt and 3 smaller parcels wrapped in brown paper for fittings, snapped twine around them, and placed them in Margaret's arms without ceremony. "Tell Lady Müller no credit beyond this week, unless arrears are settled." Margaret inclined her head once. Outside the rain had not eased. She stepped back into it with silk for a fallen marriage and paper for a failing household, carrying both as if her hands had always been made to bear what other people spent. She had taken only 6 careful steps along the slick curb when the lane erupted into noise. A crack split the rain. Wood gave way with the sharp report of a musket. A pair of bays reared against their traces, eyes white, steam bursting from their nostrils. The leading wheel of a dark carriage sheared clean through at the hub and folded under the body. The carriage lurched sideways, slammed into a post, and threw its door wide. A child in a navy coat struck the stones and skidded through water and grit. A man in a greatcoat jumped after him, landed badly, and went to one knee with a choked breath. Margaret did not think. She dropped the parcels against the wall under the nearest awning and ran. Rain slapped her face. Mud pulled at her boots. The child was trying to rise and failing, one arm bent at a sick angle beneath him, his small hat crushed in the gutter. He made no cry at first. Shock held him silent. Then sound arrived all at once, thin and high, and it cut through her chest. She knelt in filthy water, slid her hands beneath his shoulders, and drew him clear of the wheel track as the broken carriage rocked. "Hold still," she said, voice low, steady, close to his ear. "Look at me. Breathe with me." He could not have been more than 8. Brown lashes clumped with rain. Pale face. Mouth trembling hard enough to chatter. She saw the wrist at once, not broken through the skin, dislocated. Swelling already climbing. She stripped off her right glove, tore the wet linen cuff from her sleeve with her teeth and left hand, and looped it above the joint to brace and bind. Her fingers shook with cold. She ignored it. She angled his forearm against his chest. He gasped and tried to pull away. She held him firm. "Once," she whispered. "It will hurt once, then less." The crowd pressed in and widened and pressed again. a ring of hats and umbrellas and open mouths. Someone shouted for a constable. Someone else shouted for the driver. The horses stamped and fought the traces, iron shoes striking sparks from wet stone. A man in livery lay half under the step, groaning, one leg trapped by splintered wood. Rain ran in silver lines off lacquered panels and pooled red where a hand had left its mark on the carriage door. "Stand back!" The command cut through lane and crowd like a blade through thread. No one mistook to whom it belonged. The ring shifted, men retreated. A path opened. Margaret looked up from the child and saw him clearly for the first time, tall, even bowed by pain, broad across the shoulders beneath a rain-dark greatcoat, black hair plastered at the temples, a scar, pale and old, running from the left cheekbone toward his jaw, where stubble shadow could not hide it. His right glove was split, blood seeped through the leather at the heel of his palm and dripped steady and dark onto the stones. His face held no panic, it held winter. He dropped beside them with controlled precision. He did not waste movement, he did not waste words. "Edmund!" The boy's eyes flew to him. "Papa!" The single word carried fear and relief and pain in equal measure. Margaret felt the man go still at it, as if stillness were the only way he could keep his own fear from breaking loose. "I am here," he said. "Look at me, not your arm." His gaze shifted to Margaret then, direct and hard and unflinching. It took in her torn sleeve, her bare, reddened hand braced around his son's wrist, the mud soaked through to her knees, the plain bonnet with loosened pins, the patched cuff on the other arm, the bruise darkening beneath wet wool at the edge of her wrist where cloth had pulled back. His eyes were grey, not soft grey, but storm water over slate. "You moved him clear," he said. "Yes, my lord." "Can you hold him while I free Harris?" She nodded once. He rose at once, turned, and with 2 footmen and a groom levered the shattered step high enough to drag the coachman clear. The trapped man cried out and then sagged, conscious but dazed. Orders snapped through the rain. "Cut that trace! Get the rear team from the mews! Send for Wren at Halewick House! Now!" Every man who heard him moved. Margaret kept Edmund against her. The child had begun to shiver violently. She drew him closer, felt his wet curls against her chin, and spoke the sort of measured nonsense that steadied frightened animals and frightened children alike. "Count with me, 1 to 10. Again. Good. Keep your hands still. Brave boy." He clung to her sleeve with his uninjured hand and tried not to sob. His breath came in bursts. She watched his pupils, his skin colour, his breathing. No head wound she could see, no rib catch, arm, shock, cold. By 8:30 the rain had turned finer, but the cold bit deeper. Bootsteps stopped in front of her again. The man crouched, his injured hand hidden now behind his coat. He had torn off his ruined glove. Blood traced the web of his fingers and ran down to his cuff. He did not appear to notice it. "Your name?" "Margaret Müller, my lord." Recognition moved through the nearest onlookers like a murmur carried on wind. A fishwife under an awning drew in breath. A clerk whispered, "Harlewick." Everyone in London knew the title. The Duke of Harlewick had returned from war with half his regiment dead, and his wife buried within the same year. He appeared in Parliament when required, in court when compelled, and in no drawing-room that sought amusement. People called him many things in private, and never to his face. None of those names had prepared her for the controlled ferocity of him kneeling in street water beside his injured son. He studied the binding at Edmund's wrist. "Who taught you this?" "My father kept medical manuals for the warehouses. We had accidents." "Can you set it?" She met his eyes then, because the question required truth. Not here, not in this cold. I can hold it until a physician arrives. Edmund made a small broken sound and pressed closer. The Duke's jaw tightened so hard the scar pulled white. He looked at his son's hand gripping Margaret's sleeve, and then back to Margaret's face. You will come with us. She stared at him, rain dripping from the brim of her bonnet to her chin. My lord, I cannot. I have deliveries. I must return these parcels before noon. The parcels can wait. They do not belong to me. Neither does my son's pain. You have his trust. You will ride. Authority was not loud in him. It was absolute. She should have lowered her eyes and obeyed at once. She should have remembered Lady Muller's timetable, the cost of delay, the certainty of punishment. Instead, she heard herself answer with the only currency she had ever possessed in that household. If I fail to return with the receipt and the fittings, there will be consequences. His expression did not soften. It altered by a degree. He looked once toward the parcels under the awning, then back. What consequences? Silence held for one breath too long. Around them, men lifted the coachman onto a door taken from a nearby shed. Someone led the horses away. Edmund whimpered into her shoulder. Margaret felt heat rise in her face despite the cold. Domestic ones, my lord. His eyes dropped deliberate to the bruise at her wrist. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter and more dangerous. Liar! The word was not shouted. It landed between them with the weight of judgment. You are bruised. You are soaked through. Your sleeve is torn from your own body to bind my son. Your boots leak. Your hands are split to the bone. Do not tell me you fear a scolding over ribbons. Shame burned first, then anger, sharp and clean, rose under it. She lifted her chin, still kneeling in mud, still holding his child. I fear hunger, my lord. I fear dismissal with nowhere to go. I fear that if I do not carry what I was sent to carry, the wrong people will pay for my delay. For a moment he said nothing. Rain tapped at the carriage roof. A bell struck the quarter somewhere beyond the lane. He was close enough that she could smell wet wool, steel oil, and the copper tang of his blood. When he answered, each word came clipped and final. I will account for your delay. I will send a note under my seal. If your household contests it, they may contest me. She did not know whether to feel relief or dread. Perhaps both were the same shape in different light. A uniformed runner arrived at speed, breathless, with a folded card case. Your Grace, a carriage from Halewick Mews is 2 streets off. Good. Bring blankets. The runner vanished again. Edmund shifted and gave a cry as the unstable joint moved. Margaret tightened her hold and soothed him. The Duke watched her hands, as if memorizing each finger placement. He had gone pale beneath the rain and blood loss, though he stood straight. His right hand trembled once, almost imperceptibly, then stilled. You are hurt, she said before caution could stop her. He looked at his hand as if seeing it for the first time. It can wait. It should be bound. Later. Now, she said, and the words surprised both of them. His eyes sharpened. No one spoke to him in that tone. She expected rebuke. It did not come. Something that was not approval and not displeasure crossed his face and vanished. Attend to Edmund, he said. That is your charge. The replacement carriage pulled up hard at the curb, wheels hissing in rainwater. A footman jumped down with 2 thick wool blankets and a travel rug. The Duke took one blanket, wrapped it around Edmund and Margaret together because the child would not release her sleeve, and tucked the edge at the boy's shoulder with a competence so practised it looked like habit born of too many nights of fever and fear. He then offered his uninjured arm to lift Margaret to her feet. She hesitated a fraction, then took it. Heat shot through her numb fingers where skin met wet cloth. He did not let go when she swayed. Up close, he was taller than rumour and harder. The scar near his jaw was old cavalry work, she thought. The line at his brow had been carved by grief, not age. Water beaded on his lashes and did not soften his gaze. "Look at me," he said. She did. "You are under my protection until I release you to your own door. Do you understand?" The words should have felt like another order from another powerful mouth. They did not. They felt like a locked gate closing between her and the world she had just crossed on foot. "I understand, Your Grace." He nodded once. "Good." The footman reached for Edmund. The boy clutched Margaret and shook his head wildly. "No, not him. Her." The Duke's mouth tightened. He could have overruled the child. He did not. "Then she rides with you," he said. He turned to a secretary who had appeared with astonishing speed and produced paper beneath his coat. "Write as I dictate." He spoke without pause. "To Lady Müller, Hanover Square. Miss Margaret Müller is detained by my command as witness and necessary attendant after a carriage accident involving my household. All duties assigned to her this morning are suspended. Any complaint is to be directed to Halwick House." He held out his bleeding hand for the seal ring. The secretary hesitated, staring at the blood. The Duke's eyes lifted. "Now!" Wax was melted under a cupped lantern. The seal went down hard. He gave the folded note to the runner. "Deliver directly. Wait for acknowledgement." "Yes, Your Grace." Only then did he step back and gesture to the carriage. "Inside!" Margaret gathered the parcels, the stamped receipt, and Edmund in one awkward movement and climbed in. The blanket dragged water across the leather seat. Edmund folded against her side, exhausted by shock, breathing in small, ragged pulls. The Duke entered after them, filling the opposite bench with a controlled stillness that made the carriage feel smaller than its size. He knocked once, on the roof. The horses surged forward. As the lane slid away behind rain-streaked glass, Margaret looked down at the child in her arms, then at the Duke's bloodied hand braced on his knee, and understood with a cold clarity that the morning she had been ordered to carry silk had broken on another axis entirely. The carriage rocked over ruts and standing water, and Margaret tightened her hold around Edmund until the jolting eased. He had stopped crying in full voice. That frightened her more than the crying had. Children who went quiet too quickly were either exhausted or slipping into shock. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to the side of his throat, counting beats against the rattle of wheels. Fast, thready, still strong enough. "Edmund," she said, "can you tell me where you are?" He swallowed hard. "In Papa's carriage." "Good. Do you know your age?" 8. "Good. Keep speaking. It will steady you." His injured arm lay trapped between them in the wet sling she had made from her own torn sleeve. The linen was already dark with rain and street grime. Not clean enough, not secure enough. She needed dry cloth, rigid support, heat. She needed the physicians sooner than they would arrive in this traffic. Across from her, the Duke of Halwick braced one boot against the floor to absorb each turn. His blood had soaked through the cuff of his shirt now and marked the leather seat in narrow streaks where his hand rested. He had gone even paler. He did not seem aware of it. Margaret looked at that hand, then at his face. "Your Grace, you are still bleeding." His gaze stayed on his son. "Attend to Edmund." "I am attending to him. I can also count to 2. For the first time since the lane, his eyes lifted fully to hers. Grey, steady, evaluating. Rain traced the edge of his jaw and vanished into the collar of his greatcoat. "You have a habit of issuing orders upward, Miss Müller." "I have a habit of stopping blood when I see it." A pause. The corner of his mouth moved by a fraction, not warmth, not mockery, only recognition of an answer he had not expected. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat with his uninjured hand, withdrew a folded white handkerchief, and held it out. "Take this, then. For Edmund first." She accepted it. The linen was fine and dry. She unwound the wet strip from Edmund's forearm as gently as she could, set the boy's elbow against her bodice to keep the joint from shifting, and rewrapped with firmer turns. He hissed once through his teeth and went rigid. "Look at me," she said. He did, eyes glass bright with pain. "You are doing exactly what you must. Brave is not quiet. Brave is staying still while it hurts." His lower lip trembled. He nodded. The Duke watched every movement of her fingers. She felt his attention like a second pulse in the narrow space. Not the coarse scrutiny she knew from drawing rooms and market stalls. This was precise. He watched as if her hands were instruments, and he intended to remember each use. The carriage slowed, then surged again. A groom's shout carried through the rain. They had turned into a wider street. By 8:45 they reached Halewick House. The gates opened before the carriage stopped, iron sweeping inward under the hands of 2 drenched porters. The house beyond rose from mist and rain like carved ash, all stone frontage and narrow windows too severe for ornament. Footmen were already at the steps with lanterns, though morning had broken hours before. A physician's chair had been set near the side entrance, blankets stacked on it, hot bricks wrapped in flannel at its base. Someone inside understood urgency and had prepared for it. The Duke stepped down first and turned at once. "Bring the blanket with him!" Margaret gathered Edmund and the wool around both of them. Her knees nearly failed when her boots hit the flagstones. Cold had stiffened her joints during the ride. She recovered before anyone could reach for her, though she heard one footman draw breath at the state of her skirt and sleeves. A woman in dark bombazine met them at the physician's door, keys at her waist, iron-grey hair pinned without vanity. "Housekeeper." Her eyes landed on Edmund, then on Margaret holding him, then on the Duke's bloodied hand. Nothing in her face changed, but she moved faster. "The morning room is prepared, Your Grace. Mr. Wren has been sent for twice." "Good. This is Miss Muller. She remains with Master Edmund." The housekeeper dipped her head once to Margaret. "Miss Muller." No curiosity, no disdain, only acceptance of instruction. The absence of contempt struck Margaret with a force almost equal to the cold. Inside, heat hit her skin and hurt. Coal fire, beeswax, damp wool steaming. Her fingers began to burn as circulation returned. They passed through a narrow corridor meant for doctors and deliveries, not guests, and entered a room cleared for treatment. Table pushed back, chaise brought near the hearth, bowls and towels lined on a sideboard, a chest of instruments closed but ready. Edmund clung harder when a nurse in white apron stepped forward. "No!" he whispered, then louder, panic returning. "No, her!" The nurse drew back with practised calm. "Master Edmund, I must remove your coat." "Not you," Margaret bent to his ear. "I will help her. We must get you dry." He searched her face, found what he needed, and gave one jerky nod. Together she and the nurse cut the sleeve away rather than pull it over the injured wrist. Wet navy cloth dropped to the floor in heavy folds. Bruising had already spread from wrist to mid-forearm, mottled blue and angry red under pale skin. The joint sat wrong. Not shattered. Dislocated cleanly, she thought, if anything in a child's pain could be called clean. The Duke stood at the hearth and did not remove his coat. Water pooled under him on the polished boards. Blood from his hand tapped, slow and regular, onto the stone fender. He did not appear to notice the sound. The housekeeper approached with a folded towel. "Your Grace, if I may—" "Later," Margaret heard herself say. "No, now." 3 faces turned toward her. The nurse went still with Edmund's dry shirt half buttoned. The housekeeper looked not offended but alert. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. She held his gaze. "If you lose strength, you cannot hold him. If you cannot hold him, he will fight when the joint is set. We have little time before swelling worsens." Silence stretched. The rain worked steadily at the window panes. Then he crossed the room, extended his injured hand toward the housekeeper without looking at her, and said, "Do it." The housekeeper unwound the ruined cuff and pressed a clean pad to the split in his palm. The cut was deep enough to gape, but not ragged. Glass or iron edge, Margaret judged. The housekeeper bound it tight with narrow linen. He did not flinch. A footman arrived at the threshold and bowed. "Your Grace, message from Mr. Wren. His carriage was delayed at Charing Cross by an overturned brewer's dray. He asks 10 minutes. Send again. Tell him 5. "Yes, Your Grace." The footman withdrew. Edmund had begun to shake in earnest now, breath coming too fast. Margaret moved to the chaise and knelt so her face stayed level with his. "Listen to me. We can wait for Mr. Wren, or I can set this now, and he can secure it when he arrives." "Waiting will hurt longer." His eyes went to his father. "Papa!" The Duke came to the other side of the chaise and crouched, the movement heavy with restraint, as if every instinct in him demanded force, and none could be used here. "Do you trust her?" he asked. Edmund nodded at once. "Then we proceed as she says." Margaret looked up sharply. "Your Grace, I need 2 things. A wooden splint, narrow, and you at his shoulders. He must not twist." He rose without comment and issued the orders. A writing board was brought from the secretary's room and cut down by a footman with a saw from the coal cellar. The nurse rolled lint. The housekeeper warmed strips of linen near the fire. Margaret washed her hands in vinegar and hot water until the mud was gone from under her nails, then dried them on coarse cloth. Her own fingers trembled once from cold and spent strength. She closed them into fists, opened them, and steadied. She did not see when the Duke moved behind her. She only felt his presence settle close, not touching, absolute. When all was ready, she turned to Edmund. "I will count. On 3 I pull and turn. It will hurt. Then it will ease." His face had gone white except for 2 fever-bright spots on his cheeks. "Will you stay?" "Yes." "Promise." "I promise." She positioned his forearm with care. The Duke braced Edmund's upper arm and shoulders, one broad hand at the back of the boy's neck, the bandaged one across his chest. Father and son looked at each other. Margaret looked only at the joint. "1," she said. Edmund sucked in breath. 2. The room held itself still. 3. She applied traction, steady and firm, then rotated with the smallest necessary force. There was a soft, sickening click as the head of the bone slid back where it belonged. Edmund gave one sharp cry and then collapsed against the Duke's arm, shaking, sobbing once, twice, and then only breathing hard. Margaret kept hold for several heartbeats, confirming alignment with her fingertips. Better. Not perfect until Wren examined, but seated. "It is done," she said quietly. The Duke did not move. His forehead had lowered until it nearly touched his son's hair. The hand at Edmund's chest shook once beneath the fresh bandage, then stilled by will. She bound the wrist to the splint and wrapped from palm to mid-forearm, snug but not tight, checking capillary return at each finger, as her father had taught her beside warehouse crates and dock ropes. Pink returned, warmth held. She nodded to herself. Edmund opened wet eyes. "It hurts less." "Good," she whispered. "You were very brave." He turned his head toward his father without releasing her sleeve. Papa did not let go. No, the Duke said, voice roughened at the edges. I did not. The physician arrived 3 minutes later in a spray of apologies and rainwater, coat half-buttoned, spectacles fogged. He stopped short when he saw the finished splint. Well, he said, breathless, either I have become unnecessary or I have arrived among professionals. Examine him, the Duke said. Mr. Wren did, carefully and thoroughly. He tested pulse, movement, response to touch, then looked up at Margaret with open surprise that bordered on respect. Reduction was timely and competent. Another quarter-hour and swelling would have complicated matters. Whoever did this spared him a far uglier afternoon. Edmund answered for her, drowsy now against the cushions. Miss Müller. Wren bowed from the waist as far as his age allowed. Then I am in your debt, Miss Müller. Margaret stood too quickly and had to grip the chair back when the room tilted. Hunger and cold and the release of tension crashed over her at once. She hated that weakness. She forced her fingers to loosen from the wood. No one remarked on it. The housekeeper did not look at her directly, only set a cup of broth within reach and said, For warmth, miss. Margaret took it with both hands. The heat rose through cracked skin like pain. At the doorway, voices murmured. A runner, dripping and breathless, handed a folded note to the Duke's secretary, who crossed and gave it to his master in silence. The Duke broke the wafer seal with his thumb and read. Margaret did not mean to watch him. She watched anyway. From Hanover Square, Your Grace, the secretary said. Acknowledgement received by Lady Muller's maid. Lady Muller sends word she expects Miss Muller returned at once, when no longer required. The Duke folded the note. Once. Precisely. She may expect what she likes. He passed it to the fire without looking. The paper curled black at the edges and disappeared. A primary tension loosened in Margaret's chest and tightened elsewhere. The message had been delivered. Lady Muller had been informed. There would be no accusation of disappearance. There would, however, be reckoning. She could already hear the tone that would greet her return. Mr. Wren finished his instructions to the nurse. Rest, cooling cloths, no writing lessons today, laudanum only if pain worsened. He packed his instruments and departed under escort. Edmund's lashes drifted lower. He still held Margaret's torn sleeve in his fist as if it were a tether. She sat beside the chaise because pulling free would wake him. The Duke remained on the opposite side, standing now, one hand on the mantel, wet coat unremoved, gaze fixed on his son's face with the concentration of a sentry watching a fragile border. Minutes passed. The fire settled from raw to steady burn. Rain softened. By 9 o'clock the room had emptied to 4 people: child, Duke, housekeeper, and Margaret. The housekeeper gathered stained cloths into a basin. As she passed behind Margaret, she paused almost imperceptibly and laid a small parcel on the side table, half a heel of bread, 2 slices of cold beef wrapped in linen. "For later," she said, as if naming medicine. Margaret's throat tightened. "Thank you." The older woman gave one small nod and withdrew. Edmund slept at last. His grip slackened but did not release. Margaret shifted as little as possible, afraid to disturb him. Her soaked skirt had begun to dry stiffly in the fire's reach. Mud flaked at the hem onto Halwick carpet. She looked at the dark marks with a flash of old shame. The Duke spoke without turning. "Leave it." She glanced up. "Your Grace?" "The carpet." She had not realised she had half risen to brush at the stains. She sat back, slowly. Another silence. Not empty this time. Measured. Then he turned and looked at her. Really looked, taking in the hollow at the base of her throat, the fine tremor in her hands around the untouched broth, The skin at her wrist, where old bruising met new abrasion from the cord. "You have not eaten," he said. It was not a question. She set the cup down because her fingers had begun to betray her, shaking harder now that danger had passed. "I will eat when I return home." "No!" The word landed with quiet force. "You will eat now." She should have refused on principle, on fear, on habit. Instead, she reached for the bread the housekeeper had left and broke it. Her hands were not steady enough to hide from him. She stopped trying. He watched her take the first bite, and only then sat heavily in the chair opposite, as if some internal permission had finally been granted. She swallowed slowly, each mouthful painful and necessary. The child slept between them. Firelight moved over carved stone and wet wool and bandaged skin. When she had finished half the bread, the Duke spoke again, gaze on Edmund. "Miss Müller?" "Yes, Your Grace." "When he wakes and asks for you, you will stay." It was command, not request. Protection disguised in iron syntax, the only form he seemed willing to allow himself. Margaret looked at the sleeping boy, at the small hand still looped in torn linen from her sleeve, and answered with equal plainness, "I will stay until he releases me." His jaw tightened once. He gave a single nod. Outside, the rain thinned to a whisper against glass, and in the hush that followed, a footman appeared at the threshold carrying a dented leather dispatch case recovered from the wreck, water-dark and split at one clasp, waiting for instruction. The footman stood at the threshold with rain still on his lashes, and the dented dispatch case held in both hands, as if it might spill trouble across the carpet by itself. The Duke turned his head once. "Bring it here." The man crossed the room, set the case on the writing table near the hearth, and stepped back. One clasp hung twisted. Mud streaked the leather. A corner had split where it had struck stone. Margaret set down the last of the bread and looked from the case to Edmund's sleeping face. The boy's breathing had steadied. His lashes lay dark on his cheeks. His fingers still held a fold of her torn sleeve, weaker now, as if, even in sleep, he feared waking to strangers. The Duke rose. He did not look at the dispatch case first. He looked at Edmund's hand gripping her cuff, then at Margaret's face. "Can you remain there and work?" She understood at once. He would not have the child moved. "Yes, Your Grace." He dragged the writing table closer to the chaise himself, one-handed, the legs grating softly across the boards. A servant would have done it in 2 breaths. He did not call one. He set the table within reach of her free hand and opened the split case with a careful pull that made the damaged hinge click. Inside lay bundled papers, a small ledger, 2 sealed envelopes gone soft with rain, and a narrow metal cash box no larger than a prayer book. "Recovered from the carriage floor?" he asked the footman. "Yes, Your Grace, under the opposite bench. No one touched the contents." "Good. Find Mr. Reeves." The footman bowed and withdrew. Margaret leaned toward the open case. Damp paper and iron gall ink gave off a sharp, sour smell. A strip of wax had smeared across one envelope and stuck to another in a red-black scar. She saw, on the uppermost folded sheet, a line of heavy German script in a merchant hand she recognized by region if not by name. Her pulse jumped. "Your Grace," she said quietly. "May I?" He stepped aside at once. "Take what you need." She lifted the first sheet with 2 fingers, easing it free where moisture had glued one edge. The heading read Bremen Maritime and Surety Office, though the seal was blurred. The text below was hurried, lines slanting downward as if written in a moving carriage. Halfway through the first paragraph, she felt the floor tilt under her certainty, not from hunger now, from recognition. "What is it?" the Duke asked. She swallowed. A warning, addressed to Halwick trustees. In German. It says, forged surety bonds were circulated against agricultural rents attached to the Belem marriage settlements. It names London intermediaries. 2 names are smudged. The Duke's expression hardened by degrees. Read all of it. She did. Line by line, translating aloud in a level voice while the fire cracked and Edmund slept between them. The letter claimed that copies of legitimate bonds had been altered at maturity dates, then sold onward to creditors who believed Halwick collateral stood behind them. One paragraph named Captain Belem directly. Another referred to the Müller household accounts as transfer origin for at least 3 instruments. The final line warned that if immediate verification were not made in court, claims could be lodged against trust income before spring rents came due. When she finished, the room seemed narrower. The Duke stood with one hand on the table edge, knuckles pale under the fresh bandage. He had gone very still. By the time the long case in the corridor marked 9:30, Mr. Reeves arrived with ink, blotter, and a face trained for discretion. Reeves stopped when he saw Margaret at the chaise and the open case. His eyes flicked once to the Duke. Your Grace. Sit, the Duke said. You will take down a statement. Miss Müller translates. Every word. Reeves sat. His pen hovered. Margaret reached for the next document. It was an English copy of a surety note, cleanly written, formally witnessed and wrong in 3 places before the second line ended. She felt that old precision settle over her like armour. She compared it against the German original beneath, called out the altered dates, the falsified initials, the mistranslated liability clause that shifted personal debt onto estate trust. Reeves wrote fast, then faster. The Duke asked no unnecessary questions. When she paused to separate 2 pages sticking at the edges, he waited. When she asked for more light, he moved a lamp closer. When her damp sleeve brushed the inkstone and nearly tipped it, his hand caught the base without looking, a quick, controlled movement that saved the papers from black ruin. She did not miss that his hand was the injured one. Your Grace, she said under her breath, the bandage will reopen. Continue. She did. The little metal box yielded 4 folded drafts and a list of signatures. 2 were authentic. 2 were practised imitations. 1 bore Lady Muller's hand so clearly that denial would be theatre, not defence. Reeves finished the page, sanded it, and looked up. This is enough for preliminary injunction, Your Grace. It is enough to keep wolves from my tenants until we have proof fit for magistrates, the Duke said. Draft notices to trustees and our solicitor. Mark urgent. No copies leave this house without my seal. Reeves nodded, gathered the sheets, and rose. And Miss Müller, Your Grace? The question was mild. Its weight was not. Margaret felt it before the Duke answered. She kept her eyes on the case, fingers separating another damp corner. Miss Müller remains, he said. Reeves waited, pen case in hand. For the morning, Your Grace. The Duke's gaze did not leave Margaret's hands. Until I say otherwise. Reeves bowed and withdrew with the papers. Silence returned with the hiss of rain and Edmund's slow breathing. Margaret set the final document down and flexed her numb fingers. Ink had marked the side of her hand. A thin line of mud still darkened the hem of her dress where it touched the carpet. She was suddenly aware of every unbecoming detail at once. Torn sleeve, stiff skirt, borrowed warmth, her place in the Duke's treatment room, as if she belonged nowhere and therefore had been set temporarily between categories. She should thank him and ask leave to return. She should gather herself before fear did it for her. She opened her mouth. The Duke spoke first. Do not ask to go back there yet. She looked up. He stood near the hearth now, shoulders squared as if bracing against weather inside stone walls. Firelight cut the scar at his jaw into sharper relief. "Your Grace, if I do not return by noon, Lady Mueller will—" "Will what?" He stepped closer, not loud, not theatrical. "Withhold food, lock your door, strike you where sleeves cover the mark. I have seen enough to dispense with polite fictions." Her throat tightened. "You have seen one morning." "I have seen your hands." The words landed harder than any raised voice. He held her gaze and continued, each sentence clipped, precise. "I have seen you calculate whether speaking truth costs you supper. I have watched you apologize for bleeding on my floor. I have watched you eat as if permission might be revoked between bites. That is not one bad morning. That is a pattern." She had no answer prepared for being read so exactly. Shame flared, then anger at herself for feeling ashamed. "You do not know my household." "No," he said. "I know coercion when it sits at my table." Edmund stirred at the edge of the exchange, small body tensing, brow creasing. Margaret turned at once and laid her palm lightly against his shoulder. "Easy. You are safe." The boy sighed and settled, his grip shifting from her torn cuff to her fingers. On the other side of the chaise, the Duke lowered himself into the chair he had used before, and did not move again. Minutes passed. Firelight climbed the walls. Rain thinned, then returned in a softer patter. Margaret sat angled toward the child, arm aching, hand trapped gently in his sleep-heavy hold. Across from her, the Duke remained in the same position, forearms on his knees, eyes on Edmund. His bandaged hand had begun to stain through. He ignored it. She knew stubbornness when she saw it. She knew damage pursued out of duty until duty became self-harm. It was one of the few languages she spoke fluently. "Your hand," she said. He did not look at her. "It is manageable." "That is not an answer." His mouth tightened. "Must every person in this room command me today?" "Only those who prefer you conscious." A pause, then, very slightly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Gone before it formed. He held out the injured hand across the sleeping child, palm up. "Then bind it again." She hesitated one breath, then reached for the clean linen on the side table. To wrap his hand, she had to lean toward him, close enough to feel the heat of him through damp wool, close enough to see the faint white line of an older scar crossing the heel of his palm beneath the fresh cut. Sword work, long healed. The new wound had reopened at one edge where he had caught the ink stone. "Hold still," she murmured. He was already still. She cleaned the blood with warm water and vinegar, her touch as light as she could make it. His fingers flexed once when the sting reached raw flesh. Otherwise he gave no sign. She wound the strip around his palm and wrist, firm enough to support, loose enough for circulation. Her own fingers trembled near the knot. She hid it by checking the wrap twice. When she withdrew, he did not. His hand remained where she had set it, palm down on his knee, as if movement required a decision he had not reached. "Thank you," he said. The formality of it unsettled her more than command would have. "You are welcome, Your Grace." He looked at her then, direct and unreadable. "I had a brother." The sentence came without preface. She did not move. "He broke his arm falling from a wall when we were boys," the Duke continued. "The surgeon was delayed by weather. We waited. By the time help came, fever had begun. He lived. He never held a pistol steady again." His gaze dropped to Edmund's sleeping face. "I do not wait well where children are concerned." Something in her chest gave way by a fraction. Not pity, not comfort. Recognition of another ledger kept in silence, another account written in losses no one corrected. "I am sorry," she said. He gave one short nod as if accepting a fact rather than consolation. "So am I." A knock sounded once at the door. The housekeeper entered with dry garments folded over her arm and a plain wool shawl. Behind her came a maid carrying hot water and a comb. The housekeeper addressed the Duke. "Your Grace, I took the liberty. Miss Muller cannot return in wet clothes without inviting illness." Margaret started to protest on instinct. "Mrs. The Duke cut across her, eyes still on her face. "She is correct." The housekeeper inclined her head toward the adjoining dressing room. "If you will come with me, miss, there is a fire lit." Margaret looked at Edmund's hand around hers. She could not stand without waking him. The Duke saw it and said, "Leave the garments, she does not move." Mrs. Davies set the folded dress, stockings, and shawl on the nearest chair. "As you wish, Your Grace." To Margaret quietly, "Tea will be sent." When the women withdrew, the room settled again. Margaret stared at the dry shawl as if it were an object from a foreign country. No one in Hanover Square had ever laid out warmth for her without first extracting payment. She found her voice. "You are very certain of authority. It is useful when used correctly." "By whose measure?" "Mine," he said. Then, after a beat, "and yours, where this concerns Edmund." The child shifted and opened heavy eyes. He looked first at Margaret, then at his father, as if, checking both, remained. "Water!" Margaret reached for the cup. The Duke was faster, already pouring, already supporting the boy's shoulders with his uninjured arm, while Margaret held the rim to Edmund's mouth. The movement was practised, seamless, the kind that came from long nights, and repetition no one praised because no one saw. Edmund drank, blinked, and whispered, "You stayed." "I said I would," Margaret answered. His gaze drifted toward his father. "Papa?" "I am here," the Duke said. The boy's eyes closed again. Sleep reclaimed him in a breath. Margaret tried to ease her hand free. Edmund's fingers tightened reflexively. She gave up and sat back, trapped and oddly relieved by it. The Duke watched that small struggle and spoke without looking away. "There will be inquiries by noon, from your household, from solicitors already nervous. I will answer them." She felt the old fear rise again, practical and immediate. "Lady Muller will not be appeased by a note, even with your seal. Then she will be instructed in other language." She turned to him fully. "Do not make a war of this for my sake." A muscle worked once in his jaw. "It is already a war, Miss Muller. You have merely stopped pretending it is weather." The words hung between them, sharp and final. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice lower now, each syllable controlled. "Listen carefully. You will not return to Hanover Square today without my carriage, my man on the box, and written acknowledgement of your safe entry. If any person in that house raises a hand to you, withholds food from you, or obstructs your work on these accounts, you will send word directly to Harlwick House, day or night, through any servant, any runner, any constable in Bow Street with my name. Do you understand?" It was command. It was protection. It was an intervention that crossed every line of rank and custom he had kept around himself since she first saw him in the rain. It could not be unsaid. Margaret held his gaze, heart striking hard against her ribs. "Yes, Your Grace." He gave one curt nod, as if sealing terms before witnesses only they could see. Then, quieter, rougher at the edges than before, he added the line that changed the room. "Do not disappear on me, Miss Muller." Margaret did not look away. "I will not," she said, and the answer came so quietly that only he heard it. A hard knock struck the physician's door before either could speak again. Mrs. Davies entered with Mr. Reeves at her shoulder and a uniformed Bow Street officer behind him, hat in hand, rein on his cape. Reeves held 2 folded papers, and looked as if he had run the length of London. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. The creditors have petitioned for emergency attachment at Guildhall before noon. Belham's men filed an affidavit at 10, claiming Halwick trustees consented to the sureties. If we do not produce originals and sworn translation today, rents can be frozen by evening." The Duke stood. "Outcome of the notices." Trustees acknowledged receipt. 2 have already sent clerks. The runner to Hanover Square reports Lady Müller refused to sign for a second note and said Miss Müller was not competent to read a market bill. Margaret felt heat move through her chest, sharp as swallowed metal. Reeves looked at her then, not unkindly. "She is counting on delay, miss." The Bow Street officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, I was sent for witness security only. Begging pardon." "There was mention of attempted coercion." The Duke's voice went flat. "Remain in the corridor. You enter if I call." "Yes, Your Grace." Edmund stirred at the raised voices. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then fixed on Margaret. "Do not go." She bent and touched his hair. "I must go for a few hours so the men with papers cannot hurt your home. I will return." His hand tightened around her fingers, then loosened with visible effort. "Promise! I promise!" By 11 o'clock she stood in the adjoining room in a plain dry dress Mrs. Davies had found and altered at the waist with 3 quick stitches, while Margaret drank tea she could barely taste. Her own mended gown steamed by the fire. Mud flaked from the hem into the ashpan. Mrs. Davies wrapped the wool shawl around her shoulders and pinned it without fuss. When Margaret re-entered the morning room, the Duke and Reeves were at the writing table with the recovered dispatch case emptied in ordered stacks. Every item was accounted for: German warning letter, forged English copies, the small ledger, the list of signatures, and the metal cash box now sealed with red wax under Halwick arms. Reeves pushed forward a statement already drafted. "Miss Müller, this line confirms chain of custody from lane to table. This line confirms your translation was read aloud in the Duke's presence. This line confirms the 2 smudged names," she read. "How were the smudges resolved?" Reeves tapped a separate slip. "By comparison to Belham's Club subscription ledger obtained under warrant this morning. Harcourt Finch and Lionel Preen, both surety brokers." She signed with a hand that shook once and then steadied. The Duke signed beneath her. Mrs. Davies signed as witness. The physical evidence ceased being rumour and became record. Reeves hesitated before capping his pen. "There is one further matter. Lady Müller's counsel intends to discredit Miss Müller as dependent and vindictive. They will call her unstable." "Let them," Margaret said. Reeves glanced at the Duke, then back. "I am obliged to state strategy, miss. Social position governs what magistrates admit as credible under pressure." The Duke dismissed him with a look and waited until the door closed. "Miss Müller, I will speak plainly." "Please do." "If you walk into Guildhall as Lady Müller's unpaid drudge, they will try to break you before you reach the second page. If you walk in under my name, they will still try, but they will fail more slowly." She understood before he finished. Air seemed thinner in the room. He continued, each word measured. "I obtained a special licence after we reached Halwick, while Reeves prepared the trustee notices, because I expected Belham's collapse to reach this point. I will not compel you. If you refuse, I will still place guards, counsel, and carriage at your disposal. If you accept, it is partnership, accounts, estates, obligations shared in writing before witnesses. Your conditions, spoken now, entered now." She held the back of a chair, feeling the grain under her fingertips. "My first condition is tenant protection. No eviction for arrears tied to forged bonds." "Agreed." "My second is Lavinia's survival. A modest annuity managed, not controlled by her husband or Lady Müller." "Agreed." My third is my work. I do not vanish into decorative silence. His gaze did not waver. You will oversee reform ledgers beside me. She drew one breath. Then yes! The wedding took place in the library at 11:30, with rain striking the long windows and Edmund asleep in the next room under nurse and physician. The chaplain read quickly, but not carelessly. Reeves and Mrs. Davies witnessed. The ring was plain gold, warm from the Duke's hand. When he placed it on her finger, his bandaged thumb trembled once. At Guildhall, the corridors smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and old stone. Clerks carried bundles at a run. Petitioners crowded benches under dripping cloaks. Lady Muller stood near the hearing chamber in violet silk, immaculate despite the weather. Lavinia pale at her side in a bonnet too fine for such a day. When Lady Muller saw Margaret, her smile arrived like a knife drawn politely. So, you found a patron for your dramatics. Margaret did not answer. She entered with Halwick on her right and Reeves behind, with the sealed evidence satchel. The hearing room filled fast. Trustees, creditors, 2 magistrates at the bench, Bellum's solicitor already speaking in oily cadences about unfortunate misunderstandings. Lady Muller's counsel rose next and bowed toward Margaret with theatrical sympathy. Miss Muller is known to possess a lively imagination and a regrettable resentment toward her family. Objection, Reeves said. Argument without foundation. Sustained, said the senior magistrate. Proceed to documents. Margaret stood at the witness rail in her one borrowed plain dress, shawl pinned tight, and set the German letter beside its English forgery. She spoke clearly, column by column, signature by signature. She named where dates were altered, where liability clauses were mistranslated, where Lady Muller's hand replaced authorised signatories. She gave the resolved names of the brokers. She produced the club ledger extract under warrant. She did not embellish. She did not falter. When asked about Lavinia's role, she answered with the same precision. Mrs. Bellum signed where directed. The transfer instructions were prepared before she entered the room. She lacked German and did not draft these instruments. Lavinia made a broken sound behind her gloved hand. Lady Muller went rigid. The magistrate requested the final comparison sheet. Reeves passed it. Ink dried in the silence. Then Lady Muller moved. 2 steps. Hand raised. The Duke crossed the space before the motion finished and caught her wrist in mid-air. He didn't squeeze. He did not need to. His voice did not rise. You will not touch my wife. Every head in the room turned. Lady Muller stared, first at his hand, then at Margaret's ring, then at Margaret's face as if seeing an unfamiliar language. This is absurd, she hissed. She is a girl from my house. Margaret met her eyes and answered before any man could. No, I was a girl in my father's house. You used me in yours. The senior magistrate struck his gavel once. Enough. Lady Muller, you will stand down. Warrants were signed before the hour ended. Lady Muller was remanded pending restitution accounting and removed under escort through the side passage, violet silk rustling against stone like dry leaves. Lavinia did not follow at once. She stood in the centre aisle, hands trembling, then turned to Margaret with tears she wiped away immediately. I laughed when she laughed, Lavinia whispered. I knew and did not stop it. Margaret's throat tightened. You will live quietly and learn accounts from the beginning. No more pretending not to read what you sign. Lavinia gave one small nod. Yes. 3 days later, in a smaller chancery chamber lit by weak winter sun, the restitution order was entered. Lady Muller's control of all Muller accounts was stripped. Transportation was commuted to lifelong confinement in Bath under family surety after full asset surrender. Lavinia's annuity was set at a modest fixed amount under Margaret's oversight, protected from marital claim. Harcourt Finch and Lionel Preen were indicted on forgery counts. Captain Belham, absent abroad, was named in default. Every reported contact had an outcome. Every document was filed, sealed, and copied to trustees. By the second week of March, Edmund sat by the nursery fire with his arm in a proper sling and summoned Margaret from the doorway before any title could be offered. "Margaret, read the ship story. The one where the boy does not drown. He learns the knots." She took the book and sat. Across the room the Duke paused at the threshold, listening without entering, one shoulder against the frame, still as a sentry who had at last found a post he meant to keep. At Halwick's winter estate in late November, snow feathered the mullioned windows and the library lamps burned low and steady. Margaret stood at the long table with estate maps, rent rolls, and draft reforms spread in careful lines. Her father would have approved the margins. The Duke stood beside her, not above, sleeves rolled, seal ring set aside so ink could not catch beneath it. "Clause 7, she said, "widow's grace period extended through winter quarter." He read, nodded, and signed. She signed beside him, a knock. Edmund entered without waiting, cheeks flushed from the cold corridor, sling long gone. He carried a wooden practice pistol tucked into his belt and stopped only long enough to ask, "May we ride to the lower meadow tomorrow if weather holds?" The Duke looked at Margaret. "If accounts are closed by supper," she said. Edmund grinned and ran back out, calling for his tutor. Silence settled, warm and earned. Margaret capped the ink, stacked the completed reforms, and placed them in the red dispatch box marked Halwick Estate Tenantry. The Duke locked it and handed her the key. "Keep it," he said. She closed her fingers around the cold metal, then looked up at him with a steadiness born of winter roads, ledger lines, and a life no longer available for other people's use. "I intend to,"